Hope you're all doing well. Happy Hanukkah. Hope you're all having a beautiful Hanukkah. Okay, so we had a Mishnah. The Mishnah told us that there are 5 karbanos that are brought even in a state of tumah. Okay, the karban tamid, the shtei halechem, the breads that were brought on Shavuos. Even if the congregation is tameh, they're still going to be brought. And we just had a discussion yesterday about who is not the author of the Mishnah. We tried saying Rabbi Yeshua is not the author of the Mishnah. Ultimately, we said no. Rabbi Yeshua actually could be reconciled with our Mishnah, and he could be consistent with the Mishnah. Now we're going to try to say, find another Tana who may not fit with the ruling of our Mishnah, and that is Rav Yossi. Okay, so Nema Masnisan, we're on 78a1, second paragraph. Nema Masnisan look Rav Yossi. Maybe our Mishnah does not look like Rav Yossi. Why? The Tanya, we have a brayso that says as follows: Rav Eliezer Omer, Hatzitz Maratza Alachilos. Okay, the tzitz. Remember, the tzitz is the thing Kohen Gadol wears. It is something which atones. It's something the function of the tzitz, in addition to just being an adornment. One of the things we've already been discussing for a couple of days is that what it does is it affects atonement even when a karban is brought in a state of tumah. Rav Eliezer comes along and says that when the state of tumah exists, it atones not only for the part of the karban that is brought on the mizbeach, okay, but even the part of the karban that is eaten, okay? Now that doesn't mean it could fully be eaten, because when a karban is brought in a state of tumah, with the exception of the karban Pesach, the part that is normally eaten cannot be eaten. But what he's saying is that the tzitz has an impact not only for the part that when a person brings a karban in a state of tumah, the karban is in the state of tumah, the tzitz has the ability to impact not only the part that is brought on the mizbeach, but even the part that is normally eaten. Okay, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein tzitz maratza lachilos, the tzitz does not affect acceptance for that which is eaten. Okay, so that's the end of the brayso. Now we're going to try to make sense of this brayso. The fact that he says that tzitz does not affect acceptance for that which is eaten, Rabbi Yeshua Sverle, to Amar Bin Tarti. He must hold like Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua we spoke about yesterday, who said that in order for a karban to be accepted, in order for a karban to be accepted, both components have to be valid. Let's say both components have to be tahar, let's say, okay? So both components have to be, not tummy, okay? So what we're saying over here is as follows. The fact that he says that the tzitz does not impact the food part, the part that's not on the mizbeach, presumably he holds like Rabbi Yeshua, who Rabbi Yeshua holds that both components, not only the part that goes on the mizbeach, but even the part that's normally eaten, they both have to be fully valid for a karban to be valid. And therefore he's coming to tell us that even though the tzitz may go ahead and impact the part that is on the mizbeach, but since the tzitz does not impact the food, the part that is off the mizbeach, the part that normally is eaten, therefore the entire karban is invalid. Okay, and this is predicated on the fact that he must hold like Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that both components have to be valid, and therefore so should we say now that the Mishnah therefore doesn't fit Rabbi Yossi, because our Mishnah said that even when a karban is brought in the state of tumah, it's going to, when these 5 karbanos are brought in the state of tumah, they're going to be valid. But here we have Rabbi Yossi saying that the tzitz is not meratzah, does not provide atonement for the part that is off the mizbeach, and we're inferring from there, therefore what he's trying to convey is therefore the entire karban is going to be invalid. Gemara says, lo, maybe not. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer Svirle, really Rabbi Yossi could hold like Rabbi Eliezer, Damar Dam, Afal Pishein Basar, who said that you don't need both components to be tahar. Even if one component is tahar, it's going to be, you could have a karban that's valid. And therefore, really, Rav Yossi could actually hold that as long as the part that is on the mizbeach is valid, right? As long as the part that's on the mizbeach is valid, therefore, even though the part that is off the mizbeach, the part that is normally eaten, is invalid, remains tameh, it's still going to be a good karban. The Gemara says, so if Rav Yossi actually holds that such a karban where the karban is tameh, and that tzitz only impacts the part that is on the mizbeach, it doesn't impact the part that is off the mizbeach, and he holds that the karban is going to be a good karban. So what's he coming to tell us when he says that the karban is that tzitz only works for the part on the mizbeach and not for the part that is normally eaten? Ask the Gemara, tamech. According to your question, let's flip the question. Eliezer da amar tzitz maratze. Eliezer, who said that tzitz does impact that which is eaten. Kevan da amar dam af bishen basar. Since we have another statement from Rabbi Eliezer says there is blood even though there is no meat. Right? Rabbi Eliezer was the one who holds that you could have part of it being valid. Let's say just the part of the mizbeach is valid, not the part, not the flesh. Let's say the meat itself is invalid, but he says the blood is valid, and it can remain valid even though the meat is not valid, even though the meat is tameh. So at tzitz maratz lachilas mahilchaza, what point does Rabbi Eliezer have in teaching us that tzitz affects acceptance for that which is eaten? In other words, if they're both ultimately saying the same thing, that when you bring a karban and you bring a karban in a state of tumah, then the karban is going to be accepted either A, by saying that tzitz is maratze on the achilos, or he's saying it, or by saying it that you don't, as long as the blood is okay, because the tzitz is causing it to be atoned, so too the so too the meat is going to be okay. So too the entire carbon is going to be okay. He's ultimately saying the same thing in both cases. So the Gemara says, so really, what is Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi really coming to talk about in that brayso we just quoted above? Rather, what they're coming to talk about is not regarding whether the carbon is a good, valid carbon or not. Rather, what they're arguing about is when you have a situation and you have a carbon which becomes tamei. Okay, so both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi both hold. We're suggesting right now that the carbon is ultimately going to be a valid carbon. But what about the meat that is not going to be eaten, which is not supposed to be eaten? The meat that sits, what about the rest? What about the meat that is not being put on the mizbeach? So that meat, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he's going to hold that meat, since it sits, has an impact on the meat itself. Therefore, the laws of pigul apply. What does that mean? The laws of pigul is when I slaughter an animal and I think that I'm going to eat it beyond its prescribed time for a carbon, then that is pigul, and the carbon has. So if I eat that carbon, I'm going to be in violation of another prohibition, and there's a violation of, and me'ila, what is me'ila? Me'ila normally is when I designate an animal for a carbon, it is, and if I go ahead and use that animal, then that is me'ila. But let's say once I slaughter the animal and then I use the animal, I'm not in violation of me'ila. So what they're arguing about is exactly that point. In other words, when Rabbi Eliezer says that it sits is maratze on the animal, on the meat, what that means is that we treat it like a full-fledged carbon, and therefore the laws of pigul apply, and the laws, and me'ila is removed because I just slaughtered it. It's like a regular carbon. Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz does not impact the meat. What that means is that the animal is, you will not be able to be in violation of pigul, and you will still have me'ila because you didn't slaughter a valid carbon. So let's just read it inside. The tzitz affects acceptance for it and makes it like tahar meat, and the kavalei pigul, and it's subject to the laws of pigul, and it is exempt from me'ila. The tzitz does not affect the meat, and therefore it's not like tahar meat, and therefore the laws of pigul do not apply, and does not exempt it from me'ila. Okay, Master Rav Amari. Amari asked a question on this approach. Now we're basically saying, okay, Rav Yossi could hold like our brisa, could hold like our Mishnah. Excuse me, Master Rav Amari. He named Rav Yossi Savak Rav Eliezer. It's true that Rav Yossi holds like Rabbi. It could be that Rav Yossi could hold like Rav Eliezer, and hold that you could have, as long as one part of the, and therefore say as long as one part of the carbon, as long as the part that is on the mizbeach is still valid, because the tzitz is going to be maratza, the tzitz impacts it. Therefore, even though the other part of the carbon is not valid, because the tzitz doesn't impact it, according to Rav Yossi, still it's going to be a valid carbon, and therefore he could be the author of a Mishnah. However, Bishlam Mizvach, and that makes sense when you have slaughterings, when you have animal offerings, ikadam, there's blood that's put into the Mizbeach, and that part that sits is maratze, and therefore the carbon is good. Omer Nami, also by the Omer offering, ika kometz, there is the part which is, Omer offering is a flour offering that is brought on the second day of Pesach, and there is a part which is taken from, there's a fistful which is taken from the flour, put onto the Mizbeach, ika kometz, that part also is that part that sits impact, and therefore the person, the carbon is able to be a valid carbon. Lechem apanim nami, also by the bread that is brought weekly. Lechem apanim ika bazichin. There are the 2 spoons of levona. Elashtei halechem ma'ik lememer. When it comes to the two loaves that are brought on Shavuos, there's no part of it that is brought on the mizbeach, and therefore, according to Rav Yossi, who holds that the tzitz only is maratza for that is on the Mizbeach, there is nothing that through which we're able to get our atonement, because the only thing that is left, the only thing that is there is the shtei alechem, is the 2 things which are not brought on the Mizbeach, and that remains tamei even though you have the tzitz. So what are you going to say? Maybe you're going to tell me, okay, but there's also other karbanos that are brought alongside the shtei alechem. That is the next case in the Mishnah, which talks about the kaminol shlamim offerings. Right, the Mishnah gave a list of 5. And one of the examples was shtei halechem, the 2 breads were brought on Shavuos, and then shalmei tzibur, which is the next example, which is offerings that are brought on Shavuos. That's an additional example. Imkein havlu arba. If you want to tell me that they're talking about the same thing, then we really only have a list of 4. Vanan chamisha tznan, and the Mishnah listed a list of 5. Alex Rav Yossi tumu huch b'tzibur. So Gemara says, I have another answer. Really, Rav Yossi, the Mishnah could let go like Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi holds that the tzitz in general only goes over the parts that are on the mizbeach and not the parts that are not on the mizbeach. We asked what about shtei lechem? No problem, because Rav Yossi holds Tuma hutra b'tzibur, that tuma is when the tzibur, when the congregation is tamei, then there is no issue of tuma whatsoever. It's completely out the window. You don't even need the tzitz over here, and therefore even by shtei alechem, when nothing is brought on the mizbeach, the thing is completely allowed to be, is completely accepted, because tuma hutra b'tzibur, right, as opposed to dechuya b'tzibur. The Gemara says that's not true. Both the case of the kohen gadol praying for Yom Kippur and the kohen preparing to burn the part of duma. Okay, so there's 2 cases where you have someone where we're going to be concerned maybe the person is tamei. So mazon lav kol shiva mikol chatasha yisham. Okay, according to Divrei Meir, Meir holds that on every day of the 7 7 days before the Kohen brings either the blood of the ashes of the paraduma, or the Kohen Gadol prepares for Yom Kippur, for the 7 days before he gets sprinkled with the purification ashes. Okay, so Rav Meir says every day you have to do that. Okay, why he holds every day? Discussion for another time. Rav Yossi Omer, the only days you sprinkle are the days day 3 and day 7. Okay, so but the point is that even Rabbi Yossi, who's the person we're talking about, he holds that we are concerned that maybe this guy, the Kohen Gadol is tamei, and therefore we have to sprinkle him on day 3 and day 7 because maybe he's tamei. But wait a second, if Rabbi Yossi holds like you're arguing now, that he holds tuma hutra b'tzibur, that there is no tuma whatsoever, that tuma when the congregation is tamei, and there are these situations where we override tuma, there is no tuma at all, okay, and therefore you don't need to do any sprinkling. We don't have to worry about a potential maybe he's tamei. If it's techuya b'tzibur, then it's begrudgingly, and therefore we have needed tzitz, and we need to do every possible rectification to try to be as good as possible, to try to make it as tar as possible. So therefore we understand sprinkling. But if you hold tuma hutra b'tzibur, if the Kohen Gadol is tamei as it gets into, if the congregation is tamei as it gets into Yom Kippur, we would say tuma hutra b'tzibur according to Rav Yossi. So el mechavarta masdisint look Rav Yossi. Gemara says you're right. Ultimately, we fall back and say our mission does not go like Rav Yossi. We have no way of reconciling our mission like Rav Yossi. Now the Gemara is going to analyze another statement by Rav Yossi. A little more straightforward. Rav Yossi, shtar mezaki leveitrehu. Rav Yossi says a ruling, which we're about to read in a moment, which is like a document that awards the same thing to two people. Imagine a real document. I borrowed this car, this car from Yassi and from Ari. Who did I borrow from? Which person, right? I can't. Then I owe this car now to the same two people. I can only give it to one person. Bottom line is, it's a way of saying that he said a contradictory statement. What is the contradictory statement? What is the contradictory statement? The time we learned to the price. Rav Yossi, Roni is to Rabbi Eliezer mizvachim. Rabbi Yossi says, I understand or I see virtue in the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Again, Rabbi Eliezer is the one who holds that if one part is okay, if one part of the carbon is okay, you don't need the other part of the carbon. Meaning, if you like the part that's on the mizbeach is valid, then the whole thing's gonna be valid, even if the meat is not valid, if the part that normally eats is not valid. So I see that by animal offerings, and I see virtue of Rabbi Yeshua by animal offerings, and I see virtue of the words of Rabbi Eliezer by mincha offerings, and I see virtue in the words of Rabbi Yeshua in mincha offerings. Okay, already it doesn't make sense. They argue with each other. You can't say like I understand what Hillel is saying, and I understand what Shammai is saying. I understand what Hillel is saying, I understand what Shammai is saying. Which one do you hold like, right? So it doesn't make sense. So now he goes into more details. I see the virtue of Eliezer's words regarding animal offerings. Rabbi Eliezer held that there is blood even though there's no meat. And I see the words of Rabbi Yeshua regarding animal offerings, who said, I need both. If there's no blood, there's no meat. If there's no meat, there's no blood. Meaning if one of them is valid, the whole thing is invalid. I see virtue of the words of Eliezer regarding mincha offerings. Rabbi Eliezer said that as long as the kometz is valid, even if the remainder is invalid for whatever reason, it's lost, it's tamei, it's all good. But Rabbi Yeshua nachas, and I see value in the words of Rabbi Yeshua regarding mincha offering. If there is no remainder, there's no kometz. If there's no kometz, there's no remainder. Okay, how do we make sense? So Rabbi Yossi is contradicting himself. So Gemara says a couple of possible answers. Amalei, Mistaber Kamar. Rabbi Yossi is saying like this, that it's reasonable to presume ki kaiv zvachim amar. He said this when he was learning zvachim. Okay, they're learning zvachim, daf yomi, for those daf yomi people. Okay, they're learning zvachim, and while they're learning zvachim, Rabbi Yossi said, and they learned the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua in regards to zvachim. He said, just like they argue here by Mizvachim, they presumably also argue by Menachos. When they're learning Mizachas Menachos, he said, just like they argue by Menachos, they also argue by Zvachim. Amarle, Rapapa said to Abai, that can't be. I understand when they are learning Zvachim. Rabbi Yossi said this. But just like they're arguing by Zvachim, they also argue by Menachos. Because the main psukim are actually written by Zvachim. Remember, the pasuk said that you spill out the blood, and that's used for the meat. It said blood and meat in the same pasuk. So again, Rabbi Eliezer said, you just need the blood. It doesn't matter if you have the meat. Rabbi Yeshua said, no, you need both of them. But that's a pasuk by Zvachim. So Elakikai b'nachos v'amar. But when they're learning menachos, how could Rabbi Yossi say menachos? Just like they argue menachos, they also argue Zvachim. The main psukim are Zvachim. How can you say just like they argue menachos? Presumably they argue Zvachim. Of course they're arguing Zvachim. That's what the main psukim are. So that can't be what they're saying. Ela lokasha. This is the way to read it. So the way to read Rabbi Yossi is Rabbi Yossi was saying, I understand, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer when the eaten part became tamei, there I agree with Rabbi Eliezer that the eaten part became tamei, then it's still, the whole thing's going to be valid. Rabbi Yeshua said that if one part is missing, it's invalid as ba'avud v'sarf, when it's lost or burnt. The Gemara says mitzvah my time, but when it became tamei, why does Rabbi Yossi agree to Rabbi Eliezer? Mishum demarat tzitz, because the tzitz presumably goes ahead and allows that part to be tahar, or like the tzitz overrides the tumah. Hashamas the Rabbi Yossi, the problem is Rabbi Yossi himself, we just learned a few minutes ago, said that the tzitz does not affect acceptance for that which is eaten. So that can't be the pshat. Elokasha, another answer. Rowan is to Rabbi Eliezer but tzibor, Rowan is to Rabbi Yeshua b'yachid. So maybe the way to read it is like this. I agree with Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to a communal offering, okay, and there if the edible portion becomes tamei, it's going to be good, and I agree with Rabbi Yeshua by an individual offering. So the Gemara says b'tzibor my time. What would be the reason for this distinction? Mishum tumah hutra b'tzibor. It must be because he holds that when it's a tumah that affects the entire congregation, it's permitted, meaning it's fully permitted, as opposed to techliya, which means we pushed it off, right? And therefore he says that when it comes to a communal offering, then even if a part of it's missing, even if part of it is lost, even part of it is tamei, it's still going to be good because tumah hutra b'tzibor, it doesn't matter. But we treat it as if there's no tumah there whatsoever. First, that doesn't make sense either. First of all, we just established a few minutes ago that Rabbi Yossi holds that tumah is overridden regarding a tzibor, and he doesn't hold tumah hutra b'tzibor, right? That we saw that from the sprinkling of the kohen gadol. V'od, and furthermore, ibet tzibor, if it's a communal offering, Rabbi Eliezer machshir v'lo Rabbi Yeshua, does that comes out that Rabbi Eliezer would hold that it's going to be valid. Rabbi Yeshua by a communal offering would hold that it would not be valid. The problem is 78b1 ha'amras b'tzibor after Rabbi Yeshua Amud. At the end of yesterday's year, we saw that Rabbi Yeshua himself agrees when it comes to communal offering that even though normally he needs both the blood, the thing on the mizbeach, and the eaten parts, but when it comes to the tzibor, he agrees that you only need one. So Ella Roanes de Rabbi Eliezer b'diyaved, Rabbi Yeshua lechatchil. This is our final answer. So rather, what Rabbi Yossi was saying is he agrees to Rabbi Eliezer after the fact, meaning that if one thing became tamei, lost or burnt, then after the fact it's going to be okay. But Rabbi Yeshua lechatchil. But ideally, really, you shouldn't have been performing the avoda if part of it became tamei, lost or burnt. Okay, diyaved if they were Yeshua nami modahu. Okay, the Gemara says, wait a second. Rabbi Yeshua himself agrees b'diyaved. Tani, we learned in a brisa, moda Rabbi Yeshua shimzar kurza. Rabbi Yeshua agrees that if the blood was thrown, it's okay post facto. So don't say, I agree to Eliezer regarding after the fact. Rabbi Yeshua, basically just agreeing to Rabbi Eliezer, or just agreeing to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua himself says, lichatchil shouldn't be done, but after the fact it should be done. The Gemara says, no, you misread the brisa. Hava tuma. The brisa was specifically talking about a case of tuma, where it became tamei. Hava ava b'saraf, where it is lost or burnt. Rabbi Yossi's ruling was talking about a case where it's lost or burnt, meaning, kiktani moder Rabbi Yeshua shimzar kurza. When does the brisa teach Rabbi Yeshua agrees that if the blood was thrown after the fact, the offering is going to be accepted? Bin nitma, when the meat became tamei, there'll say if the blood was thrown after the fact, it's going to be okay. Ava ava b'saraf lo, but when it was lost or burnt, Rabbi Yeshua does not say after the fact to be okay. When did Rabbi Yossi say I agree to Rabbi Eliezer after the fact that it's going to be okay? But Avodah Sarv, when it was lost or burnt, there we'd agree. Even though Rabbi Yeshua disagree, Rabbi Yossi holds Rabbi Eliezer in that respect. Okay, have a wonderful day. Happy Hanukkah.